Chapter 6 3 Little Women. With their fresh plan now unfurling before them, the anti-tepid revolution found the old fires of determination rekindled within them. The possibility of ending the ridiculous reign was within their grasp, and they couldn't wait to be rid of it. Abrian spent any free time annotating their map and plotting out the route, showing the sailors exactly where they needed to go. They didn't like being told how to sail by a failed notion, but listened to him as patiently as they could. They were far more interested in Pippa the dragon, though Morland insisted she was kept away from their cabin. He had a little fruit tree in a pot by his bunk, which Pippa was desperate to dig in. None of them knew what kind of fruit it grew, and Morland wasn't one for straight answers. Honno and Morphea worked hard at showing they were the sensible failed notions, who knew exactly what they were doing, though it looked a lot more like showing off to everyone else. Annie and Dominator were both a help and a hindrance in their own way. They almost blew up the ship's stove on the second day, nearly decapitating EA as he tried to sneak a few potato scones. When they weren't picking out failed notion fur and bits of stove from their food, or trying to get on with their jobs, the Nausians actively avoided Gina. Morland and Bligh had done their best to teach her, but it transpired her mind was, as they put it, a dancing head of dragons. Not only was she a sight to behold, but anything they instructed her to do came out charred and squished. She was far too interested in having an adventure, being free and alive at last. She sat at the tip of the prow, yelling with delight as waves crashed over her with Delilah nearby, being as brave as she could despite the seasickness. Above all the chaos, noise and excitement of each day, Gie floated in the rigging, the lookout point, or else deep in the bowels of the ship as his companions whispered their plans and ideas to each other while swinging in their hammocks. They shared their hopes of seeing Failed nor Dry again, and tried to imagine the rain monster at their journey's end, as the intoxicating thrill of travel, the unknown, and adventure sped the ship on its way. That isn't to say those early days weren't difficult for the failed notions. By the 5th day they had been travelling through an immensely thick soup of sea fog, making navigation almost impossible. This put all the sailors in a very bad mood, and by nightfall the novelty of adventure had definitely begun to wear off. That was why Abrian was wandering raggedly down the narrow passage towards the sleeping quarters at a very uncomfortable hour in the morning, having finally been relieved from his night's work. The long days and constant rocking were still new to him, and made him feel nauseous and tired. Bleary-eyed and yawning, he walked straight past the boys' sleeping quarters. Stumbling slightly, he only noticed he was going the wrong way when he made out a gaggle of female voices. In vehement Nausian tradition, the girls' sleeping quarters were set apart from the other failed notions. Gina, Morphea, Delilah and Annie had their own private cabin near the forecastle. The sailors insisted any idea of mingling was unquestionably improper. They slept in their own quarters by the stern, two to a cabin with doors locked against failed notions at all times. Realising his mistake, Abrian made to turn around, but as he did, the voices grew louder, and curiosity overcame him.
I hate it!
He heard Gina screech. Inside the cabin, Gina's hair was busy, eating yet another brush.
Gina, calm down. The others will be trying to rest,
Delilah calmly said, trying to placate her.
But it's not fair!
Gina yelled, trying to prise the brush from the jaws of her hair.
I hate my new hair! Come on, Gina. Getting stressed will just make you lose control and you'll go into your element,
Morphea grumpily chimed in.
It's too long and it eats things! In that way it suits you,
Morphea chuckled. Gina glared at her, but Morphea was impervious to death glares. Delilah sighed and attempted to rescue the brush from its prison.
You're still getting used to your body. It took me a while to get used to being this height when I was brought back,
Delilah said soothingly.
Yes, but you're a grown-up. You're meant to be tall,
Gina said through gritted teeth.
You're a grown-up too now, technically,
Morphea sighed.
I know, but that's not the point. Gina, please,
Delilah said.
Besides, if you think carnivorous hair is bad, imagine what it's like for poor EA and GA. What do you mean? Well, they were in the same body for so long, it must have been weird to be suddenly apart.
Delilah finally pulled the brush from Gina's hair.
That's ignoring the fact that EA is now covered in scars and stitches, and GA doesn't even have a body anymore,
Morphea added.
Yes, but GA imagines himself into being. I can't imagine away my hair.
Gina huffed.
No, but can't you see how tiring it is for him?
Delilah said, now plaiting Gina's hair.
Now what do you mean? He constantly has to use up some of his mind to imagine his shape. If he doesn't, he won't look like anything. But he can look any way he wants to. He wants to look like himself, but he can't do that without using up energy. I wake up and like how I look, but GA can't without thinking about it all the time. Oh,
Gina said thoughtfully.
EA is also in a bind about how he looks,
Delilah continued.
If one day he decides he doesn't want stitches anymore, he can't just take them out. I suppose so. I know your hair bothers you, but you can cut it off if you really want to, and it'll grow back. EA and GA can't do something like that. What's worse is we don't know if EA stitches are painful or if GA is really self-conscious about being blue. I never thought of that,
Gina said quietly.
All done,
Delilah announced, having finished Gina's hair.
Thank you,
Gina said, still in thought.
What's that noise?
Asked Morphea after a moment.
Outside their room, Honno dragged Abrion back to the boys' sleeping quarters. He'd fallen asleep by the cabin door midway through the girls' conversation. When Abrion gently awoke, much later that day, the wind was whistling shrilly around the topmost heights of the mast. All the canvas had been gathered up and secured to the yard. The hull was groaning and creaking as if it regretted something it had eaten. Abrion peeped his head out the hatch and caught his breath as it froze in his mouth. Dense, silent snow was falling fast all around and gathered on the heads of a very nettled crew. Now Abrion understood why Pippa had been burrowing furiously into his spare clothes. Everything was achingly cold. Most of the sailors, along with their captain, were peering over the rail and murmuring seriously to each other. Honno, Delilah, Clea and the others were huddled on the opposite side. Abrion scurried over to join them, hands stuck under his armpits to stop his fingers being nipped by the wind.
Are we nearly there yet? Dominator scowled at him.
No, we drifted too far up the map in all that sea fog. Seaward says this is the Aurora wind. It's on its way towards home. You know, bringing all the cold weather with it for when winter comes in Feldnor. We've just met it halfway on its journey.
Ooh! Squeaked Abrion. Well, how exciting! So this is where our seasons go when they're not in Feldnor.
Well, winter definitely,
said Delilah, her teeth chattering.
There certainly isn't any summer nearby.
And what's worse, Honno added, now the Aurora wind has met all the strange rain that seems to be everywhere, and it started snowing here.
I think my fingers are getting blue,
said Bligh, his cape wrapped tight around him. Although he couldn't feel the cold, seeing all his companions shivering made him come out in sympathy, and he subconsciously imagined he was chilly too.
I really do hope we can get moving soon,
he mumbled.
That depends,
said a voice possibly cooler than the surrounding snow, as Oola came over to them with arms folded. He had that particular look in his eye that the Feldnotians were quickly learning meant unpleasant things were headed their way.
Depends on what?
asked Danny.
It depends on how quickly a group of willing volunteers can break this ice.
Ice?
Echoed Abrion.
Yes,
said Oola, who always relished shattering their naivety.
That's solid substance. That is water when it is cold. Last night, the currents took us into sea ice. Unfortunately, as we turned about, the wind was too strong for us to make any decent headway before the chill closed the ice around the hull. But not to worry,
he added.
Myself and the crew will begin breaking the ice closest to our hull. Meanwhile, I think you, and also you,
he pointed to Hono, Abrian and Ie,
shall head out and begin breaking the ice further away to give us room to manoeuvre.
Why us? Blurted Hono, who did not think this fair. Oola looked at him as if the answer was obvious.
Because you are lighter than us Nosians, better balanced with your tails, and are in need of something more constructive to do other than patronising us, complaining, or reading.
Oola glanced at Ie, who immediately snapped his book shut.
You'll be needing these,
said Haidur, coming up alongside Oola with a sizable load of clothes. The sailors had been provided with supplies for all sorts of weather, though in truth they had never thought they would need all of them.
And what about us?
Said Gina.
What are we supposed to do?
Oola's lip curled. He loved victims who were willing.
I thought the rest of you could either manage the weapons or help us with breaking free the hull.
Why do we need weapons?
Asked Delilah shrewdly, whilst Hono, Abrian and Ie rummaged in the piles of clothes and began pulling on thick trousers and gloves, all a bit too big, over their own clothes.
Oh, in case of monodons,
said Seaward.
They get curious.
All the failed notions looked at him. What are they dangerous? Said Abrian, his leg half in a trouser.
Not very.
Haidur shook the snow off his hat and planted it back on his head.
But they grow as big as you and have a tooth that grows right up out of their heads, and it's as long as their bodies.
They sometimes swim up to the holes in the ice for air,
said Oola, leaning against the rail.
So we'll have the weapons just in case one of you's accidentally stabbed. Then your friend can fire an arrow into you, so you can die quickly.
Gie laughed nervously.
That would be funny. Then there'd be more ghosts, I suppose.
He glanced sideways at Oola, who showed no sign that this was a joke.
Oh.
Gie's smile faded as he turned back to his friends. They stoically continued pulling on warm clothes, though now looking rather pale. None of them saw Haidur and Seaward's sniggers as they caught their captain's eye. What is this? Cried Hono, suddenly pulling something big and furry from the clothes pile. Haidur strode forward, took hold of the furry item, and slung it down over Hono.
It's called a coat, you fool. Now hurry up and get on with your job.
But it's fuzz, said Ie, holding another coat at arm's length, while Hono struggled into his own.
Fuzz,
repeated Seaward.
They're fur coats, yes, but specially imported, I'll have you know. Probably from some wondrous warm creature from the high-up snow-laden mountains, I expect.
Oh, no. These are made of failed notion baby fuzz, declared Abrian, taking a deep sniff from a third coat. I'd know it anywhere. I didn't think anybody did this anymore, came Hono's muffled voice from the depths of his coat. Bah! His head burst through the neck hole. It's a bit outdated. Seaward and Haidur looked very doubtful.
Did what?
They asked. Sold off baby fuzz, said Abrian simply. Oh, it's not what you think, he added, as he saw the horror rising in their faces. Us failed notions are born with a thick layer of fuzz, or fluffy hair, I suppose you'd call it, nearly all over. It's to keep us warm and dry while we're still tiny, but it all falls out by the time we can walk, and there's always an awful lot of it. So some failed notions would collect up the fuzz and sell it off. There was always the occasional merchant or wanderer who would buy it and work it into clothing for tough outdoor pursuits. I suppose these were bought from a travelling tradesperson, eh? He smiled at the sailors, whose faces were scrunched, trying to digest this information.
These are coats made from the fluff of field notion children,
asked Seaward slowly. What's wrong with that? Said Hono, now settling into his coat quite comfortably. They don't need it any more. Besides, this could have been my own fuzz once upon a time. He pulled up the hood which fitted snugly around his head.
Or mine or my sister's,
cut in Gina.
Or me or my brother's,
nodded Gie.
Dear old Daddy certainly would have done anything to get rid of our fuzz. I think he was allergic to it.
It's so soft, said Abrian, sinking into his own hood. And cosy, EA mumbled.
That's enough of that,
announced Seaward, stepping in before any of them could regress any further, seizing their scruffs and tossing them over the side.
Get to work.
Oh, and you'll need these.
Called Haidur, dropping down 2 large mallets and a shovel after them.
Remember not to get stabbed.
And so, after a decent amount of trudging and grumbling, Honno, Abrian and EA found themselves in the middle of the frozen sea, beating, scraping and shoveling at the icy mass beneath them, occasionally casting a look over their shoulders to check they could still see the ship. They had walked about 200 yards from it, but the snow was descending so thick and fast it was difficult to see what was what amidst the swirling white chaos. Evening had already draped itself across the sky, and they were beginning to think wistfully of warm drinks and bed warmers. They greatly appreciated their new coats. The hoods had a clever design which meant they drew up over their heads and fell over the top half of their faces, protecting them from the wind chill. Eye holes had been cut into these and framed with light, bent metal to keep their shape, so the hoods balanced well on their noses and didn't obscure their sight. Even so, after an hour's constant work, their fingers and toes were feeling the bite of the cold and hurting something awful. Hang on one moment, gasped EA, casting down the shovel to stick his fingers inside his coat and bobbing up and down in pain. Fingers frozen. Don't make too much noise on the ice, Honno hissed. You'll attract the monodon thingies. Well, you've just been hitting it with a mallet for the past I don't know how long, said Abrian, continuing to beat away at the ice. Well, we're all stuffed then, aren't we? Snapped Honno. Here. He thrust a mallet at EA. I'll try breaking it with the shovel. But EA suddenly whipped round, staring into the blizzard. Honno frowned and peered over his shoulder to see what EA was looking at. What is it? Can you hear what that is? EA pointed into the near distance. Both Honno and Abrian squinted until they saw a large, light grey shape sticking up out of the sea ice. Is it an iceberg? Suggested Abrian in a hushed voice. You know, large frozen waves that float in colder places like this. It probably got stuck in the sea last night, said EA. I think that's another one over there to the right of it, a bit nearer. There was indeed another equally large and indistinct shape, scarcely discernible in the gathering dark. Should we take a look? Asked EA doubtfully. It's just more ice. Leave it, said Honno, turning back to the patch they'd been working on and beginning to beat at the ground with the shovel blade. We have more, he struck hard, than enough, he struck again, ice to deal with. Crack! The blade thrust through the top of the ice and stuck fast, leaving the handle wobbling and completely perpendicular. Honno, you've given me an idea, cried Abrian, wheeling about and seeing what had happened. Quick, quick, EA, get your mallet. Honno, you hold tight to the handle and keep it steady. No, not at the top, along the middle. That's it, like that. EA, you've got the mallet. Good. I've got mine. Brilliant. Now, Honno, stay absolutely still. Oh, I'm not going to like this, Honno groaned, shutting his eyes. All right, ready? Said Abrian, raising his mallet. He caught EA's eye and mouthed, Be very careful. EA nodded, focusing hard. Now! Both Abrian and EA swung the mallets and struck the shovel handle as hard as they could. Honno let out an involuntary squeak. With a grating crunch, the shovel cut straight through the ice and shot into the freezing waters below. Ooh! Abrian shouted. Look at that! Did it work? Asked EA, peering down at the hole they had made. Absolutely it did, said Abrian, dancing a little on the spot. Thank you, Honno, for the inspiration. Think nothing of it, came the reply, as Honno did his best to regain some of his composure. But where's the shovel gone? He asked. Oh, I think we've lost it down there, said EA a little guiltily. I don't suppose the sailors will mind. We can still use the mallets. Abrian knelt over the edge of the hole. I can't see anything down there at all. Suppose they really wanted it back? Don't lean so close! Hono pulled Abrian back. You know what Captain Oola said. One great big long tooth and then it will be... He mimed being shot with an arrow. There are no monodons around here, said Abrian flatly. And any that are have probably just been concussed by a sinking shovel. Before Hono could argue back, EA suddenly motioned both of them to be quiet, looking very concerned. What is it? Asked Abrian, bemused. You said that those nearby large things I heard were icebergs, whispered EA. Yes? But icebergs don't have voices. And then the net came down. None of them had time to even blink. Before they knew what had happened, all three were pinned down by the weight of a net so large they could hardly move, though they struggled like mad as two huge pairs of arms bore down on them. Hono and EA were scooped up under the first pair, and Abrian was slung under one half of a second, his legs kicking uselessly as the two icebergs turned and with large shaggy heads bowed against the wind, headed off into the snow. High above the creaking ice in the ship's lookout point, Bligh had watched the unfolding catastrophe with mild surprise. Two large shapes had emerged from the blizzard, seen his friends, and then thrown a net over them and carried them off, disappearing back the way they came. Perhaps because it was late, and because nothing interesting had ever happened while he was on watch, Bligh had stayed afloat, staring out at the hole in the ice where his friends had been not minutes ago. It took a few moments for some key thoughts to chip their way to the front of his mind, such as that perhaps this wasn't supposed to happen, that no one on deck seemed to have noticed, that he really ought to do something.
He didn't like raising his voice. He scanned below for any of the crew.
Hello?
On the deck below, Bligh looked up.
You say something,
he called. Bligh looked from the deck out to the ice and back again.
You might want to get the captain.
The wind blew the last of his words away. Bligh frowned. Bligh tried again, a little louder.
My friends and brother have been kidnapped. I think we should tell the captain.
Bligh shrugged, not hearing a word.
My friends have been kidnapped. I think we should tell the captain.
Why don't you come down and say it?
Bellowed Bligh, cupping his hands over his mouth.
Pardon!
Why are you shouting?
Asked Morland, wandering over to see what the noise was about.
Our ghost is trying to say something,
said Bligh. Both looked up into the rigging. From a distance they saw Bligh waving and pointing, getting more frustrated before finally folding his arms irritably.
Never mind! I'll go sort it out, you tell the captain!
And with that, he flew out of the lookout point and off into the night.
Where does he think he's going?
Asked Bligh.
Maybe he needed the toilet,
said Morland, grinning.
Do ghosts go to the toilet?
Said Bligh thoughtfully.
You know, I don't know.
Both stood in a haze of contemplation, staring after Bligh. It was only then they noticed the distant hole in the ice and the abandoned mallets.
Bligh.
Yes, sir?
I think you should fetch the captain.
Far from the ship, Hono, Abrian and EA were being carried further and further away. Their arms were pinned to their sides, and no matter how much they flailed and struggled, their captors took no notice. It was simply no use. In the end, their legs got tired from kicking, and they were left dangling pathetically as their abductors marched on. After some time, each veiled notion noticed the ice beneath them had changed. The massive footfalls of their captors had become quicker and more confident. They must have come off the sea ice and were now climbing sloping land. Hono was able to make out humped shapes in the snow which must have been houses. More and more appeared, becoming increasingly elaborate as they drew away from the shore. Their captors kept on at a swift and furtive pace through snow-covered streets until they turned abruptly, strode up a set of steps, and through very heavy doors which one had pushed open with their boot. Honno, Abrion, and Ie were deposited in a cool, circular hole sunk into the middle of the floor, like the mouth of a well. The charred remains of enormous logs and dusty ashes beneath their feet told them they were standing in an enormous fire pit. Abrion started trembling. They had entered a long stone hall with a vaulted roof made of tremendously large wooden beams. The air tasted of smoke, and dense shadows crept in the corners. An iron brazier set in a bracket on the wall was filled with flames, along with several others around the hall, as the two enormous people lit the place with a dim light. These people were each 9 feet tall, and built like oak trees. Their hair was long, pale, and grew nearly all over their faces, except for their eyes, which were as bright as stars on a cold night. They were snowmen, and neither of them had met a failed notion in their entire lives. Each sat down at the end of one of the benches that ran the length of the hall and talked thoughtfully to each other. Honno, Abrion, and Ie couldn't understand their language, and were far too concerned about their immediate fate to care what they were saying. While the failed notions were distracted, this is what was said.
Rather sweet, don't you think? Very small. Must have got awfully lost. Perhaps they came off a trading ship. There are no trading ships. The Nosians know not to send them here. These are snowman waters from miles around. Strange little things, aren't they? Maybe they came down the mountain looking for food. That would explain the digging. Should we feed them? They seem very nervous. If we feed them, they might not go away. Then we have to look after them forever. We have enough responsibilities. Poor little creatures, they look so confused.
As this debate went on, Honno and Ie managed to give Abrion a leg up, and he was in the process of pulling himself out of the pit. One of the snowmen spotted him just as he wriggled onto the floor.
Oh dear, why that small one? Where are you going?
He said, stepping over to Abrion in a single stride and picking him up carefully by the scruff. Abrion squeaked and squirmed, having no clue what was going on. In fact, he squirmed so much he slid out of his coat and landed on his friends back in the fire pit. This gave both snowmen quite a surprise.
Ooh, did you see that? What did he do? I didn't do it, it did it by itself. What's that in your hand?
The first snowman saw he was still holding something furry, yelped, and dropped the coat like it was a severed limb. The coat, being a piece of clothing, didn't move but lay lifeless on the floor. Both snowmen gazed at the coat before gingerly picking it up. They examined it very carefully in their large hands, taking in the little buttons and eye holes. Their eyes flicked between the coat and Abrion in his travelling clothes, and then to Honno and Ie. Something in the smoky atmosphere seemed to have shifted from philanthropic to rather embarrassed. Then, without warning, both Honno and Ie were picked up and found themselves swiftly stripped of their coats, not to mention their jumpers, gloves, and winter trousers, until the snowmen were quite convinced that nothing else would come off. They were now also quite convinced they had not picked up 3 little lost furry creatures, but 3 small furry-tailed persons. These persons were left standing in the fire pit, shivering and feeling extremely foolish in nothing but their underwear. The snowmen had stripped Abrion as well, just to make sure. Both looked very rattled. Clearly this wasn't what they thought they'd rescued. One sat down on the end of the long benches again, leaning his elbows on his knees.
Well, what sort of creatures are they? Could they be Nosian or from somewhere further away? Too small to be real Nosians. And which Nosians have you seen with those tails? No folk from further away have tails. It's too warm in those places. Could be Nosian spies. They look too scared for that. Reluctant spies, then?
They were stumped. Both snowmen knew this was a very serious matter. What if these strangers were from Nausea? If these 3 little people went on their way, would they tell others what had happened? The snowmen had been trying to live peacefully these days, and certainly didn't want to give Nausea any excuse to think otherwise. In fact, they would rather eat their own eyebrows than give the Nauseans a reason to pester them. Not too long ago, when Nausea still had a king, there had been a short, uncomfortable war between the two lands. It had all started with a peace agreement. This had been Nausea's idea. They had felt very intimidated by the size and strength of the snowmen ever since they'd first met. Even though the snowmen had never laid a finger on any Nausean, the king and his officials didn't like having a neighbour with legs thick enough to wade through all their rules and regulations. Finally, one bright spark thought of drawing up a contract that would grant them protection from the snowmen, thus binding them with the only card the Nauseans had left: honour. Each land would be honour-bound to protect the other. After all, it was in Nausea's both their interests to have someone who would look out for them. As a plus, both parties would be able to live harmonious distances away and not tread on each other's toes. And Nausea would get those big scary people on their side. Everything had been going to plan. The snowmen, a little nonplussed, had agreed to meet with the king. They all gathered with their representatives on a small, indistinct piece of land between Nausea and Snow-Emma, the snowmen's island home. This would act as a symbolic neutral ground for both of their rulers to sign the agreement. However, Nausea's king and the leader of the snowmen got into a dispute about who would honour their honourable agreement more. And, as was the case with so many of these disputes, both sides always said the other started it. Both leaders, full of the best intentions, continued to swear that they could out-honour the other. Finally, Nausea's king took it into his head the leader of the snowmen was insinuating that he and his people were more honourable than the Nauseans. Naturally, as all sensible people do, the king decided the only way to settle this would be to challenge the snowmen to a battle, the victor being the most honourable. This was a very poor idea in the grand scheme of things, since Nausea were quite small in numbers and stature compared to the snowmen. And, after all, these were the people they were seeking peace with in the first place. The battle lasted 3 days, with the usual rest breaks in between. However, to everyone's surprise, not least themselves, Nausea won. Rumour has it this only happened because of powerful magical reinforcements who turned up in the nick of time. Meanwhile, the snowmen, now very sick of Nauseans, signed the agreement, bade them a good day, and never darken their doorstep or come within their sight ever again, or there would be trouble. And Nausea, peace agreement in hand, presumably felt they had proved some kind of point. Back to the situation at hand, and, for all of these reasons, the two snowmen decided whatever these 3 little people were, they could not let them go. Not to mention, Nausean or not, if word got out that the snowmen had kidnapped some poor defenceless creatures, no one would do business with them. No one would trade with or come anywhere near Snow-Emma, and that would put the whole island in a pinch. Reputation was everything. Nausea they could do without, but the rest of the world... Honno, Abrin and Ie were paying a lot more attention to the conversation now, feeling their toes grow cold and sooty as they stood in the fire pit. A sense of deep apprehension was dredging its way through the room.
Perhaps we could raise them as little snowmen.
Could we put them out to work?
Perhaps we should release them in the mountains.
They might follow us back.
There was a moment's silence. Then suddenly one of the snowmen clapped his hands with a shout.
Aha! I know just the fellow. Fetch Oratid. Oh! Oratid, what an idea!
The second snowman jumped to his feet. The failed notions felt the ash beneath them quake slightly, and strode out of the hall into the snow. The doors swung shut with a thud. The first snowman busied himself sifting through the failed notion's clothes. He bundled up everything except the coats and slung it into one of the braziers. After that, he laid out their coats on one of the tables, arranging the arms just so. He carefully pulled off the buttons and plucked out the bent metal in the eye holes of each hood. He glanced over his shoulder at the three failed notions and put a finger to his lips in a gesture that transcended every language barrier. Presently his companion returned. He was in rapid conversation with another snowman who was rather shorter than the others. Presumably this was Orlatid. As soon as he was through the door, he made a beeline for the coats. He picked one up, held it to the light, gave it a deep sniff and felt the soft fuzz with his broad thumbs.
Yes, they are wonderful. I think I'll happily take them.
The first two snowmen beamed.
Good. Now would you like to say these?
They indicated Hono, Abrian and Ie.
Come free. They are also yours. What funny little things are these?
Wondered Orlatid, looking intrigued as he stooped low to peer at them.
They are from where those marvellous coats come from,
said the first snowman confidently.
Their fur grows back, so we're told. Share them each summer, and you'll have enough to make very good use of. Will they grow any bigger?
Asked Orlatid.
With a good diet, yes, possibly,
said the second snowman sensibly. Orlatid chuckled.
They have little people faces like ours. My daughters will love them.
He straightened up, looking very pleased.
I owe it to you for passing these on to me. Where did you say you bought them?
The two snowmen deserved an award for their acting.
On the far side of Snow-Emma. A trading vessel. Insistent we buy them. We can't take them, though. You know. Responsibilities. Mouths to feed. Snow. Of course,
said Orlatid, nodding judiciously.
Anyway,
said the first snowman, clearly keen to wrap things up.
They are yours now. We will help carry them to your house. I'll take the biggest,
said the second snowman, hurrying forwards.
Quick as a wink, each failed notion was scooped up out of the pit and hoisted under the arm of a snowman. The thick doors were pushed open, and they were out in the snow again. The trio headed up a steep slope, winding through labyrinthine paths lined with snowmen houses that looked grey and solemn in the night shadows. Hono, Abrian and Ie were almost glad, despite their situation, of the huge arms that enveloped them. If you've ever been in the snow in nothing but your underwear, you'd be glad of any shred of warmth too. The snow stung their faces, and the air felt cruel and bitter in their chests. Meanwhile, the snowmen seemed hardly bothered by the wild weather, and carried on as though the blizzard was nothing but a mild drizzle. After around 20 minutes, they finally halted at another large door. This was shoved open, and the snowfall was cut short as they all entered Orlatid's house. The three failed notions were set down at the foot of ceiling-high shelves, stacked with a myriad of fabrics. There were rugs and tapestries too. Some were thick and moth-eaten, threadbare and well-trodden. Others looked like they were in the midst of being restored, laid out on wide workbenches. There were also threads, buttons, beads and ribbons, and what could have been a mannequin, though it was clearly designed for making clothes for someone at least twice the size of an ordinary person. The two snowmen and Orlatid carried on their hearty conversation, shaking hands, laughing, and making jovial promises of repayment, happy times, and the best of fortunes. Then the door swung shut as the first and second snowmen made their cheerful exit, feeling very pleased at their own cleverness, and dusting their hands of the whole business. The failed notions were left behind, quite disarmed at finding themselves who knew where, the newly acquired property of an 8.5-foot-tall cloth merchant. Far from help, far from the ship, and further still, or so it felt, from a warm set of clothes. What they didn't know was that help wasn't as far away as they thought. Each of the snowmen had been so preoccupied with talking and laughing that not one of them noticed the faint blue figure following them from a lofty distance ever since they had left the hall. Now Gie knew where his friends were, he waited to see what would happen next. He understood as much of the language as they did, and hadn't seen the goings-on in the hall. All he knew was that his friends had been carried into this house, and seemed to have lost their clothes.
Typical,
he thought to himself as he floated, barely visible by a window. Through the thick slats of the shutters he could see a portion of the room and its colourful trappings. Honno, Ie and Abrion looked very uncomfortable. Kie wondered if he should try and get their attention, but then the gigantic form of Orlatid blocked his view. Kie shifted his position and very cautiously stuck his head through the wall to see what was going on. Orlatid approached his 3 purchasers with a measuring stick and a little notepad. Despite the almost overwhelming urge to scramble away through any possible exit, Honno, Abrion and Ie's most recent trip through the snow had significantly slowed that instinct down. So Orlatid was able to record each failed notion's height, weight, and general condition. Even Ie, who had a bad biting habit, knew it wasn't clever to sink his teeth into fingers as thick as Orlatid's, as the snowman checked the condition of his teeth and jotted this down. Clearly this was the proper procedure for any newly acquired livestock. Orlatid then delicately scorched all these numbers onto wooden tablets, which he strung around their necks. When this task was complete, he arranged them into a neat row, then changed his mind and rearranged them, and then rearranged them again until their presentation seemed just right. He patted each one on the head and left the room without a word. They could hear his thudding footsteps disappearing into rooms unseen. For a long while none of them dared say a word. Honno looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him up, while Ie was still trying to get the taste of hands out of his mouth. Abrion was staring blankly at the numbers on his tablet, his mouth forming silent words. "I'm how short?" This seemed like the perfect opportunity for Gie to make contact, but before he could float any further through the wall, a distant sound started in the further parts of the house. It was approaching fast, growing ever louder until it burst into the room in an explosion of skirts and long pale hair. The explosion saw the 3 failed notions, and promptly exploded some more.
Oh, aren't they precious?
Would you just look at how tiny they are?
Oh, and Inga, this one has a little tail too.
Why, they all have tails!
Have you ever seen anything like it?
Oh, I'd like the fair one!
No, you can't, Grow. That one's mine. We agreed.
Oh, could I keep the smallest?
You must choose one each,
said Orlatid, appearing behind his 3 daughters. The girls couldn't have been more than teenagers, but each was more than 8 feet tall. Couldn't we rotate them on a loan basis?
I admire your business sense, Yossi, but no, my word is final,
smiled Orlatid.
Each one of you must look after your own little fuzzy. It would be very good for all of you to learn some responsibility. Now pick one, and remember, they must stay in good condition if we're going to get any more fantastic coats.
Gie watched half amazed and half amused as the bickering girls picked 1 failed notion each. It was lucky, really, though none of his friends felt that way, that the girls spent the next several hours doting on their unfortunate new pets, because it gave him ample time to think of a way for them to escape. He was beginning to get thoroughly bored before the girls finally traipsed bedwards, yawning and dragging their failed notions with them. Remembering their father's instructions, each did their best to make a little makeshift bed for their pet in the corner of their rooms. Gie had to make an extra effort to stay hidden as he followed them, since the girls kept ducking into each other's rooms to compare. It was only when Orlatid warned them he would use their hair for making coats if they didn't go to sleep that they finally went quiet. At long last, Honno, Abrion and Ie were left alone, installed in modest piles of cushions filled with heather and sprigs of lavender, and, after what felt like a very long time, the house finally dozed into silence. Hours drifted by. Outside by the wall of the house, Gie shook himself awake.
They must be completely asleep by now,
he whispered to himself.
Maybe I can chance a look?
Choosing an appropriate spot, he peeped through the wall and saw he was in the bedroom belonging to the eldest girl. Abrion was sitting miserably in a corner, cushions piled around him and a little plate of food by his feet. Being the smallest, the girls had thought he needed feeding up. He certainly did look fed up. When he saw Gie, he opened his mouth to speak, but the girl rolled over blearily. Gie sunk through the floor and popped his head up under the bed so that Abrion could see his blue glow, but his captor couldn't.
You need to sneak out into the main passage,
he whispered hoarsely.
Then get to the biggest door. I've memorised the way they took you.
It took a couple of tries, but eventually Abrian understood. Check the others first, he whispered back.
Clea nodded and slid through the wall, searching for the other two. He spotted EA several rooms along. His hair had been plaited and replaited so many times it was kinked all the way to the ends. He was curled up in a ball, and was, remarkably, asleep. Something is definitely wrong with him, thought Clea as he did his best to wake him. This was so unsuccessful that eventually he got annoyed and went to find Honno instead, who was in the furthest room. He was sitting stoically with his back against the wall, looking resigned to his fate. When Clea poked his head through the wall, he merely looked round and said,
"Oh, you're here, are you? That took a while."
I can go if you prefer,
said Clea angrily. "No," said Honno at once. "Please, no. I want to get out."
All right,
whispered Clea, motioning him to speak softer.
But you need to follow my plan.
"I want to get out, and I want to get out right now," said Honno, his stoicism beginning to fracture. The girl in the bed mumbled something in her sleep. They both backed into the shadows, Clea trying to calm Honno down.
All you have to do is sneak out of the room, meet the others, then head down the stairs to the front door. I can show you which way to go,
he whispered. "I don't suppose you've noticed, but we're barely dressed," hissed Honno furiously.
Oh.
Clea really hadn't thought of that. "I guess it doesn't occur to you. You don't even wear clothes."
Excuse me, I wear a cape.
"It's not a cape, it's got sleeves."
It is what I want to say it is.
The girl moaned and shifted in her sleep again. Her day clothes, that had been strewn over the bed, slithered to the floor. Both stared at the dress and skirts. The longer they stared, the more an idea took root. It was a desperate idea. It was ridiculous. It was surely not going to go well. In 5 whispered minutes, the idea had been spread to the others. In another 10, 3 tentative pairs of feet crept out of the rooms, gingerly easing the thick doors shut without a sound. Clea floated beside them, illuminating the passage with his blue light. The corners of his mouth looked like they had strings tugging at them as he fought back his grin. Honno, Abrian, and EA, who had at last woken up, were busy adjusting layers upon layers of skirts and shawls underneath beautiful dresses, which were far too long for them. "This isn't very comfortable," muttered Abrian. "It's draughty in funny places."
"You'd feel a lot more drafts without them," whispered Honno, who rather suited his fetching green number. "Hey, mind my foot, EA." "Sorry," EA mumbled, as he struggled to pull his wooden tablet off over his shawls. Abrian cocked his head to one side as EA slid the tablet into the corner where the others had hidden theirs. "Say, what have you done to yours?" he asked quizzically. "Done what?" said EA. "You've scratched off the measurements," observed Abrian, peering at the tablet. EA didn't say anything but wrapped his shawl tighter around him. Clea raised an eyebrow.
Are you a bit self-conscious, my dear brother?
EA didn't look at him. Clea found this very funny.
There's no point hiding your measurements,
he sniggered.
Everyone knows we're exactly the same in height and age and everything.
Come on, you two, murmured Abrian. Clea, what do we do now?
With Clea lighting their way, they were able to sneak down through the passages of the house. Its long corridors looked eerie in the ghost's light. They entered the workshop and scuttled to the wide front door. A solid iron bolt was laid across it, thicker than a sea dragon's skull. Clea kept a lookout as they heaved with all their might, trying to ease it up, terrified of dropping it on their toes. It groaned as its hinges moved slowly at first, and then suddenly it swung violently loose. They dodged back and instantly regretted it as the bolt struck the door frame like a hammer. None of them dared to wait and see if it woke anyone, but hauled open the door and tumbled out into the icy air. The wind had died down, but the snow was far deeper now. It sank over the tops of the clumpy shoes they'd borrowed from the girls.
Gie left the house last, watchful for any sign of movement, but all was still. "Right, Gie," said his brother, tying his skirts up out of the way. "You fly back to the ship. Let them know what's happening."
"All right,"
said Gie, concentrating furiously hard on keeping a straight face.
"We'll be ready for you."
And he darted away into the night sky. Honno watched him disappear. "Wait a moment," he said. "Which way did he say we should go?" "Oh, EA," groaned Abrian. "Gie was going to show us the way." "He never told me that bit," said EA guiltily. "Do you think he'll remember and come back?" "There's no time to wait for him now. We'll just have to guess," said Honno. "I want to get out of here before all these people wake up." "Well, then we'll have to hurry. Dawn must be less than an hour away," said Abrian. They looked around for any hints of a path. There were tall houses surrounding them, and everywhere was pitch black apart from the soft light coming from the snow. "I think we need to go that way downhill," said EA. "That's where we should find the sea ice." "But which way is that way?" grumbled Honno. "I can hardly see a thing." "Ugh, this way," said Abrian frustratedly, pulling them both along. Slipping and stumbling over the skirts, they scurried down the paths. Everything seemed utterly silent apart from the crunching of snow underfoot. More than once their hearts jumped as a hefty wedge of snow slid off a roof with a hiss and a flump. The path was definitely sloping down now. They had to be careful to walk on the thicker snow to avoid losing their footing. There was still no sign of the sea, and no sign of any snowmen, but with every passing minute the sky above was gently losing its inky blackness, steadily fading into deep blue. After nearly 40 minutes of walking, they were beginning to taste a new flavour of worry. What if they had chosen the wrong route? Had they gone the wrong way? All they could see around them were houses. At length they decided to try and get a better view of where they were. A short wander took them to the side of a large house that was set on a slight ridge above its neighbours. There they found a low wall near its front door. EA clambered onto this, and, after a slight struggle, Abrian managed to climb onto his shoulders. "Well," breathed Honno, who was on lookout duty behind them. "Is there anything out there?" Abrian adjusted the shawl he had wrapped around his head, then caught his breath as he saw what was before them. They were only a few 100 yards from the bottom of the slope. From there, the houses spread out onto flatter land, getting thinner as they reached what looked like a harbour, a long wooden jetty, and— "I see it!" he gasped. "It's the sea! It's still frozen, but there's light coming up on the horizon. We'll be able to see our way as we cross." "Can you see the—" Honno called, but a cascade of snow suddenly tumbled onto their heads. A window above them had been opened, and a snowman lady poked her head through, looking straight down at them.
"Inga,"
she said.
"Is that you? It's very early for you to be up, isn't it?"
None of them dared move. She clearly thought Abrian was the snowman girl whose clothes he was wearing. Of course, since he was balanced on EA's shoulders as he stood on the low wall, together they matched the shape and height of Orlatid's daughter. He was still wearing the shawl round his head too. Unfortunately, some of the snow that fell when the window opened had managed to sneak its way down the back of his dress, making him shudder.
"Why, look, you're shivering,"
remarked the snowman lady.
"Surely you can't be warm enough in that summer outfit you've got on."
Abrian had no idea how to respond. He shrugged pathetically. The snowman lady rolled her eyes, amused.
"Teenagers, they'll never wear anything sensible. But what are you doing on the water trough?"
There was silence. Abrian didn't know what she meant. As if to help him, the water trough decided now was the time to announce its presence. They were not standing on a wall. The water inside the trough was obviously frozen, but not quite enough to hold the weight of both EA and Abrian for much longer. Oh dear. Crunch! They had a few seconds' grace before the illusion of them being girls was shattered, though they gained a few bonus seconds thanks to the shrill scream that came from EA as his legs plunged into the icy water. Abrian toppled off his shoulders and slammed into Hono, who lost his balance and grabbed the nearest thing to hand to stop himself smacking into the ground. What he grabbed was a rope. This rope was attached to the largest doorbell they had ever seen, clearly designed for 9-foot-tall visitors. The rope snapped. The bell crashed and clanged. Hono also crashed and clanged as he fell over several brushes and tools leaning by the door. Caution was flung to the winds. The three of them fled, helter-skelter down the streets as shouts sprang from the house. Hono still had the bell pull clutched in his hand. Front doors were flung open as bewildered snowmen came out to see what the commotion was about. The first shouts they heard came from their neighbours, as 3 little figures in dresses whizzed past them.
I saw them selling. 3 of them trying to climb into a house. They were in your house? No, I saw 3 tiny women. They stole my doorbell. They were raiding my house. Who's invading us? We're being invaded? We're being invaded! Battle stations!
It wasn't long before half the village was tugging on its boots and seizing nets, fish hooks and mallets, pulling down barge poles, spears, and one very fearsome halberd from its honorary place over a hearth. Soon the snowmen were mobilised, ready to defend kith and kin to the bitter, icy end. "I don't know what they're so upset about," wailed Hono as the would-be invaders hurtled towards the harbour. "It was only a doorbell!" They screeched to a halt as they reached the end of the wooden jetty, turned, and saw an avalanche of snowmen descending upon them. Without a second thought, they hitched up their skirts, leapt onto the ice, and pelted across. In the distance, the vague shape of the ship began to emerge through the morning mist. The sun was waiting in the wings to rise, and the sky was now pale blue. Hono, Abrian, and EA ran as fast as they could, but the ice was coarse and treacherous, full of bumps and dips. More than once one of them fell, stumbling over a hidden wave. Abrian's ankle went from underneath him with a nasty twang, and he crumpled. Looking up, he saw the ship ahead, the lines being pulled taut and the sails let loose. They were almost there, but looking behind, the snowmen were catching up. Their legs were stronger and longer, and they ploughed across the sea ice like it was grass. Filled with a fresh surge of panic, Abrian scrambled to his feet and flew, half running, half hopping. The ice was beginning to wobble underfoot. The hard work of the ship's crew during the night and the growing warmth of the day had weakened it. It was steadily becoming more and more dangerous with every step. There was a commotion on board the ship, some sort of argument. Then a figure leapt over the side. It was Morphea. She landed hard on the tremulous ice, and cracks splintered in every direction. Unperturbed, she ran forwards past the 3 fleeing failed notions. She was charging at the oncoming snowmen, and a dangerous light was in her eyes. 2 more figures followed her, armed with crossbows. Abrian saw they were Haidur and Seaward, and they looked very harassed as they tried to keep up with Morphea.
"Get back to the ship, now!"
bellowed Haidur. Abrian, Hono, and EA didn't need telling twice, but he wasn't yelling at them. Morphea took no notice. She slammed her feet into the ice, throwing up a spray of snowflakes, putting herself squarely between the snowmen and the ship.
"They're not going to stop!"
shouted Seaward, pushing Hono up the rope ladder to the deck, but Morphea wouldn't hear him. The snowmen thundered forward. She was in plain sight. Her fingers flexed. Let them try to come nearer. The wave of rage bore down on her. They were 200 yards away. 2 more people leapt from the ship. Morphea clenched her jaw. 100 yards. They wouldn't dare.
Morphea!
50 yards.
Morphea!
The halberd swung. Delilah and Gina pulled Morphea back just in time as it threshed the air where their heads had been. From high above them, Bligh rocketed down from the sky in a blue flash. He streaked in and out of the snowmen ranks, sending them into confusion. Wrenching her eyes from her prey, Morphea turned back to the ship with Delilah and Gina close behind her. The snowmen battered at Bligh as he circled them. He broke away and headed upwards again,
back towards the ship as the wind began to fill the sails and the hull creaked. Unfortunately, the wind also caught the ship's flag. It proudly stretched itself out from the topmast, letting the Nausean colours fly in all their glory. Being the tallest, the snowmen were the first to notice. A howl of indignant fury swelled behind Morphea, Gina and Delilah, like nothing they'd heard before, and the fragile ice shook as the snowmen charged forward again. The girls ran. The snowmen hurled everything they were holding at the ship. All three girls quickened their pace. They had almost made it to safety, dodging the nets, barge poles, boots, and other missiles that were raining down on them. It was only a moment too late that out of the corner of her eye, Delilah thought she saw a pair of abandoned mallets lying in the snow. Then suddenly Morphea, who was running ahead of her, disappeared from view. She had fallen straight through the hole in the ice made only last night by her comrades. The shock of the freezing water hit Morphea like a brick to the chest as the waves closed over her head. She kicked with all her might, but her thick, heavy boots weighed her down, dragging her away from the surface.
Hang on!
Gina skidded to a halt and plunged her arms in after Morphea. She felt her grab hold, but then the weight pulled Gina's head and shoulders under the water. Delilah ran to seize her ankles, but was waylaid by the downpour of snowmen missiles. No! Honno threw himself back over the side of the ship and pelted over to the hole. He spotted a blur to his left and saw EA running as fast as he could next to him. In a split-second burst of inspiration, Honno slung the bell pull, still clenched in his hand with fear, to EA, who caught it. Honno dived along the ice and slid headfirst into the hole, EA hanging onto the other end of the rope. Honno wrenched upwards and Morphea's arm burst through the water. With a gasp, Gina was able to pull her head up, hauling on Morphea's other arm. EA pulled them backwards out of the hole, and they all darted for the ship, which was beginning to move as the current took it. Many hands reached to pull them to safety as they struggled up the ladder. The onslaught of the enraged snowmen was left behind on the ice, their furious shouts echoing through the cold air. One last boot smashed the window of the captain's cabin, just as a triumphant gust of wind swept off the hills of Shnoema and was captured in the sails. The ship was pushed through the broken ice, out of the reach of the snowmen, and on towards the open waters of the waiting sea.